7 acres sitting behind that fence were never just real estate to me. The morning sun had finally burned through the haze by the time I parked my truck beside the old equipment shed. The smell of cedar, wet soil, and diesel drifted through the air exactly the way I remembered from childhood. At least the parts of the property they had not touched yet. A red-tailed hawk circled above the pasture. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a generator hummed from the construction site that did not belong there. I stood with one boot on the tailgate and looked across land my grandfather spent his entire life protecting. Every fence post, every drainage ditch, every bend in the creek carried a memory. My grandfather bought this property long before luxury developments and homeowner associations started spreading across the county. Back then, this was ranch country. Hard work mattered more than appearances. A handshake meant something. The small earth dam near the western boundary was his pride and joy. Nothing fancy, just solid engineering built to manage seasonal runoff and keep water available during dry summers. As a kid, I spent entire afternoons sitting beside that water with a fishing pole in my hands and mud on my boots. My grandfather always said land remembers who takes care of it. Looking at the bulldozers in the distance, I wondered what the land remembered now. The trust transferred ownership to me after he passed away, but while I was deployed overseas, most of the paperwork was handled through managers and attorneys. Taxes were paid. Records were filed. Everything should have been routine. Instead, somebody had decided that absence meant opportunity. A gust of wind carried the sharp smell of fresh asphalt from the new roads cutting across the far hillside. The sound irritated me more than it should have. Every backup alarm felt like an insult. Every dump truck rolling across the dirt felt heavier than the last. I climbed into an old utility vehicle and followed the gravel trail toward the creek. The closer I got, the worse it looked. Survey stakes stood where cattle once grazed. Bright ribbons fluttered from trees marked for removal. Concrete forms lined sections of ground that had never seen anything except grass and wildflowers. Then I noticed something else. The creek feeding the reservoir was running lower than normal. Not dramatically lower, just enough for someone who knew the property to notice. Water moved slowly between exposed rocks that should have been underwater this time of year. I shut off the engine and listened. The steady rush I remembered was missing. That silence bothered me more than the construction noise. I followed the bank for nearly half a mile before finding fresh excavation near a temporary drainage channel. Somebody had altered the flow. Somebody had done it recently. The dirt was still dark from moisture. Tire tracks crossed the embankment. I crouched down and ran my fingers through the mud. Cold, fresh, deliberate. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a property dispute and started feeling like something much bigger. Because whoever had taken my land was not just building on it. They were changing the water system that served half the valley. And if they were willing to touch that, they had absolutely no idea what kind of problem they had just created. The county records office smelled like old paper, copier toner, and burnt coffee that had probably been sitting on a warmer since sunrise. By 8:30 the next morning, I was sitting at a wooden table surrounded by stacks of maps, permit files, and property records. Sunlight pushed through dusty windows and lit the edges of documents that had not been touched in years. The clerk assigned to help me was an older man named Russell. He wore reading glasses low on his nose and moved with the calm confidence of somebody who had spent decades around land records. He glanced at the survey maps spread across the table and let out a low whistle. "That development reaches farther than I expected," he said. I did not answer right away. I was focused on matching boundary lines between old plats and newly approved construction documents. The more pages I turned, the worse it looked. Several sections of the development appeared to overlap property that was still legally tied to my family trust. Not disputed property, not gray area property, clearly documented property. Russell leaned closer and tapped one parcel number with his pen. This should have triggered additional review. My stomach tightened. Did it? He adjusted his glasses. Apparently not. The air conditioner rattled overhead while I kept digging. By noon, I had copies of zoning applications, permit approvals, drainage studies, and environmental reviews spread across half the table. A pattern started emerging. Every document pointed back to the same names, the same signatures, the same approval chain. And right in the middle of it sat Margaret Thornwell, HOA president, community advocate, self-appointed queen of suburban perfection. According to public filings, She had personally pushed several expansion proposals through community meetings. Her husband had supported related zoning adjustments during council reviews. Nothing illegal on the surface. At least not yet. But every page raised new questions. Then I found something interesting. A drainage impact report. The report described water flow entering the development from upstream sources. My upstream sources. The report relied on flow calculations that no longer matched actual conditions. Somebody had submitted numbers based on a system that existed before construction crews altered the creek. I read the report twice. Then a third time. The metallic taste of adrenaline returned. If those calculations were wrong, stormwater projections were wrong. Retention planning was wrong. Infrastructure design assumptions were wrong. Russell saw the look on my face. You found something. I slid the report across the table. He studied it quietly for nearly a minute. Then he nodded. This could become expensive. Outside, a thunderstorm was building over the hills. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, visible through the courthouse windows. The timing felt almost poetic. By late afternoon, I left with a truck bed full of copies and enough questions to fill a courtroom. On the drive home, rain started tapping against the windshield. The smell of wet pavement drifted through the vents. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the ridge line near the reservoir. When I reached the property, I stopped beside the old dam and stepped out into the cooling air. Rain rippled across the surface of the water. The reservoir remained stable, calm, patient, unlike the people trying to take advantage of it. I looked toward the development where rows of freshly framed houses stood against the darkening sky. Construction lights flickered on one by one. They looked confident, permanent, untouchable. But sitting on the passenger seat of my truck was a stack of records proving the entire situation rested on assumptions that should never have survived review. And for the first time since returning home, I realized something important. They were not just building on land they did not fully understand. They were building on paperwork they did not fully understand either. And paperwork has a way of becoming very dangerous when the wrong signature ends up under a microscope. The rain continued through most of the night, drumming softly against the metal roof of the equipment shed while I spread documents across an old workbench. The smell of damp wood mixed with printer ink and coffee that had long since gone cold. Outside, water trickled through drainage channels exactly the way it was supposed to. Inside, nothing about the paperwork felt right. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. My sister rarely called that late. Her voice sounded tired but focused. She had spent the entire evening digging through boxes of trust records stored in her garage in California. Most of it was routine estate paperwork, tax forms, surveys, maintenance receipts. Then she found something neither of us remembered, an engineering binder my grandfather kept separate from everything else. The next morning she scanned every page and sent it over. I opened the files while sitting on the porch overlooking the reservoir. The air smelled fresh after the storm. Mist hovered above the water. Birds moved through the oak trees lining the shoreline. At first glance, the binder looked ordinary. Construction notes, inspection reports, maintenance schedules. Then I reached a section labeled watershed agreements. My pulse immediately picked up. The documents described cooperative water management arrangements dating back decades. Several neighboring properties depended on controlled flow from the reservoir during dry seasons. The agreements were not dramatic. They were practical, but they established something important. The dam was never treated as a private pond. It functioned as part of a recognized water management system. That explained why my grandfather had been so meticulous about records. Every inspection, every modification, every seasonal measurement had been documented. Around noon, I drove into town and met with an engineer I knew from my Army Corps days. His office overlooked the river running through downtown. The smell of fresh paper and machine oil reminded me of field planning trailers overseas. He spent nearly an hour reviewing the drainage report I had pulled from county records. Finally, he leaned back and removed his glasses. "These numbers should not have passed review," he said. "Why?" I asked. He pointed directly at the flow projections. "Because they assume conditions that no longer exist." He explained it carefully. The development's stormwater design relied on calculations that ignored recent alterations to the creek. If heavy rainfall exceeded expectations, runoff patterns could behave very differently than projected. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, just expensive, very expensive. The realization settled over me like a weight. Somebody had been in such a hurry to push construction forward that they treated the watershed like an afterthought. As I left his office, sunlight reflected off wet pavement from the previous night's storm. Traffic moved steadily through town. People went about their day completely unaware that an entire development project might be resting on flawed assumptions. Back at the property, construction crews were still working. Nail guns popped in the distance. Generators hummed. Framing crews moved across rooftops with practiced efficiency. None of them were the problem. They were simply building what someone else approved. Then I spotted a white BMW parked beside the temporary sales office. Margaret Thornwell stepped out carrying a folder under one arm. Even from a distance, her confidence was obvious. She walked like someone who believed every battle had already been won. What she did not realize was that the questions surrounding the land were no longer my strongest leverage. The water records, the engineering reports, and the decades of documented agreements were beginning to reveal a much larger vulnerability. And every new document I uncovered seemed to point in the same direction. 3 days later, I finally got the meeting I had been chasing. The county planning office occupied an aging brick building that smelled faintly of floor polish, paper dust, and air conditioning that worked harder than it should. I arrived carrying 2 binders, a laptop, and enough supporting documents to make the receptionist raise an eyebrow. The conference room overlooked the courthouse square. Through the window, I could see flags moving in a steady breeze while traffic rolled through town below. Across the table sat a planning supervisor, a drainage engineer, and a compliance officer who looked like he had spent most of his career dealing with people who ignored regulations. For nearly an hour, I walked them through everything. Property maps, survey records, water management agreements, drainage calculations, inspection reports. Nobody interrupted much. They simply took notes and asked careful questions. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of pages turning and keyboards clicking. Then I showed them photographs of the creek modifications. The drainage engineer leaned forward immediately. He enlarged one image and studied it for several seconds. "When was this taken?" he asked. "Last week," I replied. He exchanged a look with the compliance officer. Not a dramatic look. The kind professionals exchange when they realize they may be looking at a larger problem than expected. By the end of the meeting, they had not promised anything. Government offices rarely do. But they requested copies of everything. Every file. Every photograph. Every survey. That alone told me plenty. The real surprise came later that afternoon. As I was loading boxes back into my truck, a man in a county vehicle approached the parking lot. He introduced himself as Daniel Foster from Infrastructure Compliance. Apparently, my documentation had already generated internal discussion. He spoke carefully, choosing every word. "There are some permits we would like to review more closely." The sentence sounded simple. It felt enormous. Back at the property, construction activity continued at full speed. Concrete trucks rolled through the development entrance. Framing crews moved from house to house. The smell of sawdust drifted through the warm air. Sales banners fluttered beside model homes. To anyone driving past, everything looked successful, prosperous, permanent. I parked near the reservoir and watched the operation from a distance. Then something caught my attention. A temporary pump station near the modified creek crossing. Large hoses ran toward a drainage basin excavated during construction. I grabbed binoculars from the truck. The setup looked newer than everything around it. Fresh equipment, fresh tracks. Temporary solutions usually appear when permanent solutions are not working as planned. That observation stayed with me. The next morning, Sarah called again. This time her voice carried excitement. While searching through additional family records, she had located correspondence between my grandfather and regional water authorities dating back more than 40 years. The letters documented inspections, maintenance cooperation, and watershed coordination that stretched across multiple properties. More importantly, they confirmed that several agencies had recognized the reservoir's role in local water management for decades. The deeper we dug, the larger the paper trail became. And paper trails are stubborn things. They do not care about public relations campaigns, expensive developments, or confident speeches at HOA meetings. They simply sit there waiting for someone to connect the dots. Standing on the dam that evening, I listened to wind moving across the water and watched construction lights flicker on in the distance. They still believed this was a simple land dispute. But the evidence piling up in my office was beginning to tell a very different story. And if that story proved true, the The people pushing this project forward were about to discover that shortcuts have a habit of surviving long enough to become evidence. The breakthrough arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon when a white county pickup rolled slowly down the access trail toward the reservoir. I recognized Daniel Foster before he stepped out. This time he was not alone. 2 engineers followed him carrying clipboards, survey equipment, and expressions that told me they were here for answers, not a courtesy visit. The smell of sun-baked grass and warm diesel drifted across the hillside as we walked toward the modified section of creek. Nobody wasted time with small talk. They measured elevations. They photographed drainage channels. They compared field conditions against approved site plans. For nearly 3 hours, I watched professionals quietly verify what I had been documenting for weeks. Every now and then one of them would exchange a look with another inspector. No dramatic reactions. Just the kind of silent communication that happens when experienced people discover discrepancies. The most telling moment came near the temporary pump station. One engineer knelt beside a control box and reviewed installation tags. Another checked permit records on a tablet. After several minutes, they called Daniel over. The 3 of them spoke in low voices while pointing toward the excavation area. I could not hear the conversation, but I did not need to. Their body language said enough. By sunset, they packed up equipment and headed back toward town. Daniel paused before leaving. He glanced toward the development where construction crews were still working under portable lights. "You may want to keep your records organized," he said. Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. That sentence stayed with me all night. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the development felt different. The sales office remained open. Contractors continued working. But something had changed. Several vehicles belonging to consultants and project managers filled the parking area. Meetings seemed to be happening everywhere. Groups gathered around plans. Phones stayed pressed to ears. People moved faster than usual. The confidence I had seen weeks earlier was beginning to crack around the edges. Later that afternoon, Sarah called again. I could hear papers shuffling in the background. She had located another set of archived correspondence, this time involving insurance reviews connected to watershed management responsibilities. The documents were old, but they confirmed something important. Multiple organizations had recognized downstream dependency on reservoir operations for decades. In other words, the system was never treated as isolated private property. It was part of a larger framework. The more evidence surfaced, the clearer the picture became. My grandfather had not simply built a dam. He had created infrastructure that became woven into the region's long-term planning. Standing on the shoreline that evening, I watched wind push small waves against the rocks. The reservoir reflected streaks of orange and gold from the setting sun. Across the valley, construction lights flickered on one by one. Then my phone vibrated. An email had arrived from county compliance. Attached was a formal notice requesting additional documentation related to drainage modifications and permit conditions. The language was professional and measured. But beneath the legal wording was something far more significant. Questions were now being asked through official channels. Real questions. The kind that generate records. The kind that require answers. I looked across the water toward the houses rising beyond the ridge. For months, people had treated this project as a guaranteed success. Now government engineers were reviewing assumptions, permits, calculations, and decisions that should have been examined long ago. And for the first time since returning home, I could feel momentum shifting. Not because I had won anything yet, but because facts were finally entering rooms where opinions used to dominate. The following Monday started with a sound I had not heard since this whole mess began. Silence. No backup alarms. No concrete trucks. No nail guns echoing across the valley before sunrise. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee in my hand and immediately noticed something was different. A thin layer of morning fog drifted across the reservoir. The water sat perfectly still beneath a pale orange sky. But beyond the ridge, where construction activity usually started before dawn, there was almost no movement at all. The quiet felt unnatural. By 9 o'clock, I understood why. A neighbor from farther down the county road stopped by my gate. He had heard rumors circulating among contractors over the weekend. Apparently, several review requests had triggered additional examinations of project documentation. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. Nobody had official answers. But uncertainty had spread through the development faster than any announcement. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted through the air as we talked. Across the valley, groups of workers stood near parked equipment instead of operating it. Meetings seemed to be happening everywhere. The entire project looked like it had suddenly hit invisible resistance. Later that afternoon, I received another call from Daniel Foster. His tone remained professional, but there was no mistaking the significance of the conversation. Additional inspections had been scheduled. Additional records had been requested. Multiple departments were now reviewing overlapping portions of the project. Property issues, drainage issues, permit issues, compliance questions. Individually, none of those reviews guaranteed anything. Together, they created something developers hate: uncertainty. After the call ended, I drove to the western edge of the property where my grandfather's old maintenance shed still stood. The building smelled exactly as it always had: machine oil, weathered lumber, dust baked by decades of Texas summers. Inside, I found myself staring at a faded photograph pinned above a workbench. My grandfather stood beside the reservoir shortly after construction was completed. Behind him sat the same embankment, the same spillway, the same stretch of water that now reflected the afternoon sun. For a long moment, I simply stood there looking at the photograph. Not because I felt nostalgic, because I finally understood something. He had spent decades documenting every inspection, every repair, every agreement, every measurement. At the time, it probably seemed excessive. Now those records were becoming the strongest defense the property could possibly have. Outside, a warm wind moved through the oak trees. Leaves rustled softly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a truck door slam. Then another. By evening, several vehicles left the development in a steady line. Surveyors, consultants, inspectors, people carrying boxes of documents and rolled blueprints. The atmosphere had completely changed from the confidence I encountered when I first came home. Nobody looked relaxed anymore. Nobody looked certain. Back at the reservoir, the setting sun painted the water gold. Small waves tapped gently against the shoreline rocks. The same water they had treated like a background feature. The same water connected to decades of records they never bothered to understand. As darkness settled across the valley, lights flickered on throughout the development. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in construction stood beneath those lights. Roads, utilities, foundations, framing, all of it waiting for decisions that had not yet been made. And standing there beside the water, listening to the evening breeze move across the reservoir, I realized the fight was no longer about convincing people something was wrong. The evidence was already doing that on its own. Now the only question left was how far the truth would travel once every document finally landed on the right desk. 2 weeks later, the first official notices began appearing. Bright colored postings showed up at key locations throughout the development like warning flags nobody could ignore. I saw one taped near the temporary sales office while driving past on my way into town. Another appeared beside a drainage structure near the eastern access road. The details were not public yet, but the effect was immediate. Conversations stopped when county vehicles arrived. Contractors gathered in small groups around pickup trucks. The easy confidence that once filled the place had completely disappeared. The air itself seemed different. Tense. Careful. Every movement felt slower. Every decision looked second-guessed. That afternoon, I attended a public review meeting at the county administration building. The room smelled like coffee, printer toner, and freshly cleaned carpet. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly. Property owners, engineers, attorneys, developers, local residents. People who had ignored the situation for months suddenly wanted answers. I sat near the back and listened. Charts appeared on projector screens. Maps covered display boards. Technical language filled the room. Drainage assumptions, boundary reviews, compliance evaluations, permit conditions. Most people probably found it boring. I found it fascinating, because every slide presented another piece of a puzzle I had been assembling since the day I returned home. Then came the moment that changed everything. One presenter displayed a timeline showing how multiple project approvals had relied upon information that was now under active review. Nothing dramatic was said. No accusations. No grand speeches. Just facts presented in chronological order. Yet the silence that followed spoke volumes. The chain of assumptions was suddenly visible to everyone. And once people saw it, they could not unsee it. Across the room, I noticed Margaret Thornwell sitting beside several consultants. For the first time since this began, she looked uncomfortable. Not defeated. Not frightened. just confronted by something she could not manage through confidence alone. Documents, records, dates, signatures. Facts have a way of ignoring personality. When the meeting ended, groups clustered in the parking lot under a hot Texas sky. Conversations continued beside trucks and SUVs. Questions traveled faster than answers. I overheard one contractor mention possible redesign requirements. Another discussed delayed inspections. Nobody seemed certain what would happen next. That uncertainty spread everywhere. Back at the property, I spent the evening reviewing additional files Sarah had uncovered. The smell of old paper filled the office while ceiling fans pushed warm air across stacks of records. Each document strengthened the same conclusion. My grandfather had anticipated problems long before they existed. Not specific problems, human problems. The tendency for people to forget agreements, ignore records, assume shortcuts will remain hidden forever. As darkness settled across the valley, lights from the development reflected faintly against low clouds. Construction activity had slowed considerably. Some areas sat completely idle. Equipment remained parked exactly where operators left it earlier that week. The entire project felt suspended between confidence and consequence. I walked down to the shoreline before turning in for the night. Crickets filled the darkness with steady noise. Water lapped gently against the rocks. The reservoir remained calm, unchanged by meetings, notices, or arguments. Looking across the valley, I realized the fight had entered a new phase. The evidence no longer belonged only to me. It now belonged to agencies, reviewers, engineers, and public records. The story was moving on its own. And stories backed by documentation tend to reach destinations nobody can stop once the process truly begins. The final review hearing took place nearly 6 weeks after the first county inspections. By then, the excitement had faded from local gossip and been replaced by something far more powerful: documentation. The hearing room was larger than the previous meetings, filled with engineers, attorneys, consultants, county officials, and property owners waiting to hear conclusions instead of theories. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper. Outside, rain tapped against the courthouse windows while gray clouds rolled across the Texas sky. I sat quietly near the back with Sarah beside me. Neither of us said much. We had spent months gathering records, organizing files, answering questions, and watching facts move through official channels. Now there was nothing left to argue. The evidence would speak for itself. One by one, departments presented their findings: boundary discrepancies, incomplete reviews, drainage assumptions requiring correction, permit conditions requiring reevaluation. Every presentation sounded calm and professional. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The conclusions carried enough weight on their own. Then came the watershed findings. A large map appeared on the screen showing decades of documented water management records tied to the reservoir and surrounding properties. Agreements, inspections, maintenance histories, agency correspondence. The same documents my grandfather had preserved for years inside dusty binders. Looking at that map, I felt something settle inside me. He had spent a lifetime protecting more than land. He had protected evidence. Across the room, several project representatives took notes without speaking. Margaret Thornwell sat motionless, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. The room had become a place where opinions no longer mattered. Only records mattered. Only facts. After several hours, formal recommendations were issued. Additional reviews would continue. Certain approvals would require modification. Portions of the project would need substantial reassessment before moving forward. The exact legal details were complicated, but the outcome was simple. The shortcuts had finally caught up with the people who relied on them. When the hearing ended, nobody celebrated. There was no dramatic confrontation, no speeches, no applause. People simply gathered their files and walked out into the rain. That was what real accountability looked like. Quiet, administrative, unavoidable. Later that evening, I returned to the property. The storm had passed. Water flowed steadily through the creek beneath a clearing sky. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected across the reservoir in long bands of gold. I walked along the shoreline until I reached the old dam. Everything felt strangely peaceful. Construction activity in the distance had slowed to a fraction of what it once was. Several unfinished sections sat waiting for decisions, still working through the system. But for the first time since coming home, I was not looking at the development. I was looking at the land itself. The same hills, the same water, the same oak trees my grandfather knew decades ago. Sarah joined me near the spillway, and together we stood in silence for a while. Finally, she smiled and shook her head. Pops would have loved this. I looked across the reservoir and laughed softly. No, I said, he would have expected it. Because in the end, nobody was defeated by anger, revenge, or power. They were defeated by records, patience, and the simple truth that land remembers who takes care of it. And sometimes justice arrives the same way water does. Quietly, steadily, and impossible to stop once it starts moving.